تعجل بالقرآن من قبل أن يقضى إليك وحيه وقل رب زدني علما.
But what about the believers who were sinners and so ended up in punishment of the grave after they died? What about them? Will they remain upon punishment of the grave up until the day of judgment, or does it stop for them? Here the scholars they mentioned, أما العاصي فذكر أهل العلم أن عذاب عصاة الموحدين منه ما يكون دائم ومنه ما يكون منقطع. Scholars they said that the sinners from the Muslims who end up in punishment of the grave because of their sins, some of them, their punishment continues constant up until the day of judgment, but some of them, their punishment may stop. It may come to a stop, that it doesn't necessarily carry on all the way till they are resurrected. It may stop for some at some point. Some of the scholars they mentioned that, and they said some of the reasons as to why it may stop for some of these believers who were sinners is, for example, كَدُعَاءِ أَحَدٍ لَهُ, that maybe if somebody makes dua for that individual, makes dua for him, asking Allah to have mercy upon him, asking Allah to forgive him, asking Allah to overlook his sins and wrongs, etc. That dua that you make to Allah could be a means for that person to have his punishment of the grave stopped. Some scholars mention this. Think about this carefully. We're going to come to a conclusion in a moment. So some scholars they said maybe that could occur. Some of them said maybe لِحَسَنَةٍ فَعَلَهَا فِي حَيَاتِهِ كَصَدَقَةٍ جَارِيَةٍ. Maybe that sinner from the Muslims who is being punished in the grave may at some point have his punishment stopped due to some good deed he himself had done during his life, like sadaqah jariyah, the ongoing charity. Like when you give charity to a masjid and you die, the masjid is still going to be used after your death. Muslims are still going to be coming and praying in that mosque after you die. So you continue to get the reward for it because you helped build that mosque when you were alive. You helped to refurbish that mosque when you were alive. So even after you die, other Muslims are still using that same mosque. So you continue to get the reward for it. Some scholars said maybe that could be one of the types of deeds that could be the cause of your punishment being stopped after a while. أو بحسنة تهدى إليه كتصدق أحد عنه. And some of them said maybe if someone does a good deed on your behalf, because there are some deeds you can do on behalf of other Muslims. Like for example, what? What kind of good deeds can you do but give the reward to somebody else? So you do that good deed on their behalf. What kind of deeds? Hajj, for example. You can do Hajj on behalf of someone else. And you also get the reward of doing Hajj. There is reward for you in that. But the Hajj is being intended for that other person. And also, lesser than Hajj, Umrah. Umrah can be done on behalf of somebody else. Otherwise, Build a well. Okay, so building a well is generally giving charity on behalf of somebody. You can do that. You can give charity on behalf of someone. You could give charity with the intention of it being for somebody deceased, for your father, etc. You can give charity on their behalf. You can also fast. And there are certain rulings to remember regarding that. But certain types of fasting can be done on behalf of the deceased. And there are rulings about that, though. We'll mention those another time. So there are certain types of deeds you can do for other people. There are other deeds that many people do which are not supposed to be done for other people, and they don't count, as many of the scholars have highlighted. A common one is when people recite the Quran on behalf of somebody else. They go to the grave of the person and they recite Quran and they say the reward is for the person in the grave. Many scholars have said that is not established. And there are certain other types of things people do which are not established. But Hajj, Umrah, charity, these kinds of things are established. Dua, making dua for that person. So some scholars said maybe somebody does something like that for you on your behalf, and as a consequence, your punishment of the grave is stopped. وَقَدْ يَسْتَمِرْ الْعَذَابُ عَلَيْهِ وَيَدُومُ. So, with this issue of whether the punishment of the grave is continuous from after you die up until the day of judgment, in terms of the disbelievers, absolutely yes it is. As for the Muslims who were sinners and they were in the punishment of the grave, some scholars said maybe it might stop after a while, and they gave these kinds of reasons. Others, they said, the reality is when you look at the Quran and the Sunnah, there is no clear evidence highlighting that the punishment of the grave comes to a stop. They said there is no evidence highlighting it in reality. That even for the Muslim who was a sinner and is in the punishment of the grave, that it stops. There's no clear evidence highlighting that. Whereas the evidences that talk about the punishment continuing, there are many of those. There are many evidences highlighting that the punishment continues. But there are very few or hardly any at all in reality that are clearly indicating that it stops. So then, if that's the case, if there are no real evidences highlighting that the punishment of the grave stops at some point for the sinners of the Muslims, then how did some scholars come to the conclusion that maybe it does stop? If there are no clear evidences, they made a judgment, an analogy based upon the punishment in the hellfire. The sinners of the Muslims who end up in the hellfire, do they end up in there forever? The sinners, not the mushrikun, Muslims who died upon Tawheed, but they had committed sins and sins and sins, so they end up as a consequence of some of those sins in the hellfire initially. Do they remain there forever? No, they eventually come out of that when they are cleansed and purified of their sins and enter paradise. So the scholar said maybe that's the same as what happens in the barzakh too. That the sinners of the Muslims are punished for a while in the punishment of the grave, but then eventually it stops. Just like in the afterlife, they'll be punished in the hellfire for a while, but then it stops and they go to paradise. So they made that kind of judgment that maybe the analogy could be the same regarding the afterlife and their punishment in the hellfire being temporary, that their punishment in the grave is maybe temporary too. But that is simply an analogy that they've made. There is no clear evidence highlighting that the punishment of the grave does come to an end for the sinners of the Muslims. But as we said, the other side of the spectrum, evidences indicating it continues. There are many of those.